The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Eric's auto repair shop, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. He wiped his hands on a worn rag, studying the rebuilt transmission he'd just finished. 20 years of honest work had built his reputation in this small town, where trust was earned through calloused hands and kept promises. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Eric looked up to see Harry Marshall's familiar silhouette. "Morning, neighbor," Harry called out, his easy smile brightening the workspace. He carried 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street, a morning ritual that had developed over the past few months since he'd moved into the house next door. Eric accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "You're here early today. Car giving you trouble again?" Harry's laugh echoed through the shop. "Actually, I've got something better than car trouble. I've been watching how you run this place, Eric. The way you treat your customers, the quality of your work." He paused, taking a deliberate sip of coffee. "I think we could do something incredible together." Eric raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. Harry had mentioned his background in business development before, but this felt different. More serious. "I'm listening," Eric said, setting down his coffee on the workbench. Harry's eyes lit up as he outlined his vision, a network of high-end auto repair shops across the state, starting with Eric's as the flagship location. "Your expertise, my business connections, we could transform this place into something extraordinary. I've got investors lined up who are looking for exactly this kind of opportunity." The proposal stirred something in Eric he hadn't felt in years: ambition. He'd always dreamed of expanding, but the risks had seemed too great. Now, with Harry's connections and experience. That evening, as Eric shared Harry's proposal with Laura over dinner, he could feel her tension even before she spoke. His wife of 15 years had always been his voice of reason, his anchor in stormy seas. "I don't trust him," Laura said quietly, pushing her plate aside. "He shows up out of nowhere, becomes your best friend in months, and now wants to be your business partner. It feels too convenient, Eric." "You haven't seen him at work, Laura. The way he networks, the way he thinks about business, it's impressive." Eric tried to keep the defensive edge out of his voice, but it crept in anyway. Laura's eyes softened with concern. "I've seen enough to know when something feels off. Yesterday, I overheard him on the phone in his backyard. He was speaking so differently, harsh, aggressive. It was like hearing a completely different person." "Everyone has different sides to them in business," Eric argued, but Laura's words had planted a seed of doubt he couldn't quite shake. The next few days became a dance of possibilities and hesitations. Eric found himself spending more time with Harry, discussing plans over coffee, reviewing projections during lunch breaks. Each conversation made the dream feel more tangible, more real. Harry brought over detailed business plans, spreadsheets showing projected growth that made Eric's head spin. "We could triple your current revenue within the first year," Harry explained, his enthusiasm infectious. "But we need to move quickly. These investors won't wait forever." Eric noticed Laura watching their meetings from the kitchen window, her face a mask of worry. At night, their conversations became increasingly strained. "I talked to Claire at the bank today," Laura mentioned one evening, her voice carefully neutral. "She said there's no record of Harry's supposed business history in the state. Don't you think that's strange?" He explained that, his previous ventures were under different company names, Eric replied, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The tension reached a breaking point when Harry presented the partnership agreement. "We'll need some capital to get started," he explained smoothly. "The investors want to see that we have skin in the game. I'm putting in a significant amount myself." Eric stared at the numbers on the page, his heart racing. It would mean refinancing the house, using all their savings. Everything they'd built together over 15 years. That night, as Eric lay awake beside Laura, he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Harry's words echoed in his mind: "Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all." Laura rolled over, her hand finding his in the darkness. Whatever you decide, she whispered, remember that your worth isn't measured by the size of your business. It's measured by the trust people place in you. As Eric drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something momentous. What he couldn't know was whether he was about to soar or plummet into an abyss of his own making. The contract sat unsigned on his desk downstairs, waiting for morning's light in a decision that would change everything. The weight of the pen in Eric's hand felt like lead as he signed the final document. Laura stood in the doorway of their home office, her silence more eloquent than words. The morning light caught the tears she was trying to hide, but Eric convinced himself they were tears of worry, not premonition. It's done, he said quietly, looking up at his wife. The refinancing papers and partnership agreement lay before him like a sentence passed. Their life savings, everything they'd built together, now tied to Harry's promises of a brighter future. Laura crossed the room and placed her hand on his shoulder. I hope you're right about him, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I hope I'm wrong. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Harry seemed to be everywhere at once, making calls, arranging meetings, bringing in contractors to discuss renovations to the shop. Eric found himself caught up in the excitement, despite the gnawing uncertainty in his gut. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after the signing. Eric arrived at the shop to find a notice from the bank. A large withdrawal had been made from their business account without his authorization. His hands shaking, he called Harry, who answered on the 4th ring. Just a temporary transfer, Harry assured him, his voice smooth as ever. Part of the expansion plan we discussed. The paperwork must have gotten delayed in processing. I'll have it sorted out by tomorrow. But tomorrow came and went, and Harry's phone went straight to voicemail. The contractors stopped showing up. The promised investor meetings never materialized. And then, like morning mist burning away in harsh sunlight, Harry vanished. Eric sat in his empty shop, surrounded by half-completed renovations and mounting bills. The reality of what had happened crashed over him in waves. The business account was drained. The house was leveraged. Their savings were gone. 20 years of hard work and trust, evaporated in less than a month. Laura found him there that evening, still sitting in the gathering darkness. She didn't say, I told you so. She didn't need to. Instead, she wrapped her arms around him as he broke down, his body shaking with silent sobs. I'm so sorry, he whispered into her shoulder. I should have listened. I should have. Shoo, she soothed, running her fingers through his graying hair. We're going to figure this out. Together. The next few days became a blur of meetings, with lawyers, bank officers, police detectives. Each conversation revealed new depths to Harry's deception. The business documentation was forged. The investor letters were fake. Even his rental agreement for the house next door had been paid with stolen funds. How could I have been so blind? Eric asked one night, as he and Laura sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by papers and unpaid bills. The familiar room felt different now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Laura reached across the table and took his hand. Because you see the best in people. It's why our customers trust you. It's why I fell in love with you. She squeezed his fingers. But right now, we need to see things as they are, not as we wish they were. The police investigation revealed fragments of Harry's past, similar schemes in other states, different names, different victims. Each discovery was like a knife twisting in Eric's gut. The man he'd trusted, shared dreams with, considered a friend, had never really existed. One evening, as Eric was closing up the shop, he noticed a car slowing down across the street. Through the windshield, he caught a glimpse of a familiar face, Harry. Their eyes met for a brief moment before the car accelerated away, leaving Eric standing there, rage and helplessness warring in his chest. That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of Harry's face, that fleeting smirk before he drove away, burned in his mind. Laura stirred beside him, sensing his restlessness. "He's back," Eric said into the darkness. "He had the nerve to drive by the shop today." Laura sat up, suddenly alert. "Did you call the police?" "He was gone too quickly." Eric's voice was hollow. "But he wanted me to see him. He wanted me to know he's still out there, probably planning his next con." Laura was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Then maybe it's time we do some planning of our own." Eric turned to look at his wife, seeing a determination in her eyes that sparked something in his soul, not just anger or desire for revenge, but a fierce resolve to reclaim what was stolen from them. Not just their money, but their dignity, their sense of security, their faith in humanity. As the night deepened around them, husband and wife began to talk, really talk, for the first time since the betrayal. And in those quiet hours before dawn, a plan began to take shape, one that would require all the cunning, patience, and courage they could muster. The photograph trembled in Eric's hands as he studied it, Harry with another family, another business, another life. The woman who'd given it to him sat across his kitchen table, her own hands wrapped around a cooling mug of coffee. Jennifer Martinez had driven 6 hours to meet him after seeing his online post about Harry, and the story she carried was achingly familiar. "We lost everything too," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of held-back tears. "The hardware store had been in my father's family for 3 generations. Harry, though we knew him as Henry Blake, convinced my husband that expansion was the key to survival in the age of big box stores." Laura stood behind Eric's chair, her hand resting on his shoulder, grounding him as Jennifer's story unfolded. Each detail she shared was like looking into a mirror of their own experience, the friendly neighbor routine, the coffee, the carefully orchestrated, chance meetings that now seemed so obviously planned. "The hardest part wasn't losing the money," Jennifer continued, meeting Eric's eyes with a gaze that held both compassion and steel. "It was watching my husband blame himself, seeing him withdraw from everyone who loved him. We nearly lost ourselves trying to recover what was taken." Eric felt Laura's hand tighten on his shoulder. They hadn't talked about how he'd stopped going to his weekly poker nights, how he'd been avoiding his oldest friends out of shame. But Laura knew, she always knew. "How did you get through it?" Eric asked, his voice rough with emotion. Jennifer's smile was gentle but determined. "By refusing to let him take anything more from us. By realizing that what makes us vulnerable, our capacity to trust, to hope, to see the best in others, is also what makes us strong." After Jennifer left, Eric and Laura spent hours at their kitchen table, piecing together the fragments of Harry's past that were beginning to emerge. Jennifer had connected them with other victims, a restaurant owner in Oregon, a small construction company in Texas, a family-run pharmacy in Florida. Each story added another layer to their understanding of the man who had so carefully dismantled their lives. "Look at this," Laura said, spreading out printouts from her research. "The timing of each con, the way he moves from state to state, it's not random. He studies his targets for months before making contact. Everything about his approach is calculated." Eric stared at the pattern emerging on their kitchen table. "He's not just a con man," he said slowly. "He's a predator who feeds on people's dreams." That night, unable to sleep, Eric found himself in their home office, surrounded by photos and documents. A new notification blinked on his laptop, another response to his post, this time from a woman named Sarah Morgan. His cursor hovered over her message as he read. "I was Harry's wife. The real one. Before he became the man you know." The words hit him like a physical blow. Laura appeared in the doorway, drawn by his sharp intake of breath. She read the message over his shoulder, her hand finding his in the darkness. "We need to talk to her," Laura said firmly. "She might be the key to understanding who he really is." The next morning, they arranged a video call with Sarah. The woman on the screen was elegant, composed, but Eric could see the shadows of old pain in her eyes. She spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent years processing their trauma. Harry, or James, as I knew him, has a gift for finding people's deepest vulnerabilities, Sarah explained. He doesn't just steal money, he steals trust. He makes you question your own judgment, your own worth. As Sarah shared her story, Eric felt something shift inside him. The crushing weight of shame began to lift, replaced by a growing clarity. He wasn't Harry's first victim, and unless they stopped him, he wouldn't be the last. Laura, who had been taking detailed notes, looked up. You survived him, she said to Sarah. You rebuilt your life. Sarah's smile was both sad and fierce. I did more than survive. I learned to trust myself again. And now I help others do the same. That's why I reached out when I saw Eric's post. Because sometimes the best way to heal is to turn our pain into purpose. After the call ended, Eric sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything they'd learned. Laura pulled her chair closer, taking his hand in hers. What are you thinking? She asked softly. Eric squeezed her hand, feeling the strength of their connection. I'm thinking about what Sarah said about turning pain into purpose. Harry's still out there, still hunting for new victims. We have something now that none of his previous targets had, a network. Connections. People who understand exactly how he operates. Laura's eyes lit up with understanding. You want to use his own pattern against him. Yes, Eric said, his voice growing stronger. But we need to be smart about it. Careful. We need to understand everything about how he thinks, how he moves, how he chooses his targets. As they talked into the night, their kitchen table became a command center of sorts, covered with timelines, photographs, and documented patterns. But more importantly, it became a place of healing, where victims became survivors, where isolation turned into connection, and where the seeds of justice began to take root. What neither of them could know was that at that very moment, Harry was setting his sights on his next target, unaware that the carefully constructed world of his deceptions was about to begin unraveling, one thread at a time. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Eric's heart stopped. He knew who it was before he even turned around, something in the quality of the silence that followed, in the familiar rhythm of footsteps across the concrete floor. When he finally faced Harry, the man's expression was a masterpiece of contrition, his shoulders slumped with the perfect degree of shame. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, Harry began, his voice carrying that same warm timbre that had once meant friendship. But I owe you an explanation. Eric's hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on his work rag, remembering Laura's words from their late-night strategy sessions, let him talk. Let him think he still has power over you. The network of survivors they'd built had taught them how Harry operated, how he would often return to his victims, not just to attempt damage control, but to savor their pain, to reassert his control. You owe me a lot more than that, Eric replied, carefully measuring his tone, letting just enough anger seep through to be believable. Inside, his heart raced with a mixture of fear and determination. Harry moved closer, and Eric caught a whiff of that familiar coffee shop blend, the same kind Harry used to bring every morning. The scent triggered a wave of memories, shared dreams, easy laughter, the simple pleasure of friendship. Eric had to remind himself that none of it had been real. The investors pulled out suddenly, Harry explained, running a hand through his graying hair. I had to go underground for a while to protect us both. There were threats, Eric. Dangerous people. I couldn't risk involving you. The words were smooth, practiced, perfect. Eric thought of Jennifer Martinez's story, of Sarah Morgan's warnings. This was Harry's signature move, returning with a narrative that painted him as both victim and protector. I've got a new deal lined up, Harry continued, his eyes brightening with that old infectious enthusiasm. Better than before. A way to make everything right. I just need you to trust me one more time. Eric felt a cold clarity settle over him. He could see now what he couldn't before, the calculated pauses, the subtle shifts in body language, the carefully crafted performance of sincerity. Through the shop window, he glimpsed Laura's car pulling into the parking lot, right on schedule. They had planned for this moment, knowing Harry's patterns, knowing he would return. "Why don't we discuss it over coffee?" Eric suggested, watching Harry's face carefully. "Like old times." A flicker of triumph crossed Harry's features, so quick most would miss it, but Eric was looking for it now. "I'd like that," Harry said softly. "I've missed our talks." Laura entered the shop, and Eric saw Harry's mask slip for just a fraction of a second. She wasn't supposed to be here. In his previous cons, he had always approached his victims when they were alone, vulnerable. "Harry," Laura said, her voice steady. What a surprise. The tension in the room crystallized. Harry's eyes darted between them, recalculating, adjusting his performance. "Laura, I was just explaining to Eric about the investors." "The same investors you told the Martinezes about?" Laura interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "Or the ones you mentioned to the Richardsons in Oregon?" Harry's composure wavered, just slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Eric said quietly. "Just like you know about Sarah Morgan, and the life you left behind in Connecticut." The change in Harry's demeanor was subtle but profound. The mask of contrition slipped further, revealing something harder, colder beneath. "You've been busy," he said, his voice taking on an edge Eric had never heard before. "We all have," Laura replied. "Jennifer, Sarah, the Richardsons, we've all been comparing notes. Building connections. Supporting each other." Harry's laugh was sharp, bitter. "And what good has that done you? The money's gone. Your reputation in this town is damaged. All you have is a support group of failures and victims." "No," Eric said, feeling stronger with each word. "What we have is evidence. Patterns. Proof of your activities across 5 states. And most importantly, we have each other." The security camera above the shop counter blinked steadily, recording every moment. Outside, 2 unmarked police cars pulled into the parking lot, officers who had been working with their network of survivors, building a case methodically, patiently. Harry saw them too. His expression shifted again, but this time the mask fell away completely. What Eric saw in his eyes wasn't anger or fear, but something closer to respect, the grudging acknowledgement of an opponent who had outmaneuvered him. "You've learned," Harry said quietly. "Both of you. I didn't expect that." "We had good teachers," Laura replied. "You taught us how to spot manipulation, how to recognize patterns. And your other victims, your survivors, taught us how to fight back." As the police officers entered the shop, Eric felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Instead, he felt something more complex, grief for the friendship that never was, relief that others would be protected, and a deep gratitude for the real relationships that had emerged from the ashes of betrayal. Harry turned to him one last time as the officers approached. "You could have been great, Eric. We could have built something amazing." "I already have something amazing," Eric replied, reaching for Laura's hand. "Something real." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the shop, but it brought no closure. Eric knew that healing wasn't a destination but a journey, one he and Laura would continue together, stronger for having faced the darkness and found light in unexpected places. The courtroom felt smaller than Eric expected. He sat beside Laura, watching Harry's sentencing through a lens of exhausted clarity. The man who had once seemed larger than life now looked diminished in his prison jumpsuit, his silver tongue silenced by the weight of evidence against him. Jennifer Martinez sat 2 rows behind them, her quiet strength a reminder of how far they'd all come. Sarah Morgan's testimony had been delivered via video link the day before, her words still echoing in Eric's mind, "The greatest victory is not in his punishment, but in our healing." After the judge delivered the sentence, 15 years for multiple counts of fraud, Eric felt Laura's hand slip into his. The victory tasted different than he'd imagined. There was no euphoria, no sense of triumph. Instead, he felt a quiet understanding settling in his chest. This was just one step in a longer journey. Back at the shop that evening, Eric found himself standing in the same spot where Harry had first proposed their partnership. The memory no longer carried the same sting, but it left him thoughtful. Laura found him there, silhouetted against the setting sun streaming through the workshop windows. "Penny for your thoughts," she asked softly, coming to stand beside him. "I was thinking about something Jennifer said yesterday," Eric replied, turning to face his wife. "About how survival isn't just about getting through the storm, it's about learning to dance in the rain." The spring evening light caught the silver threading through Laura's hair, reminding Eric of all they'd weathered together. The betrayal had aged them both, but it had also revealed depths of resilience they never knew they possessed. "The bank called today," Laura said, her voice careful but hopeful. "They're willing to restructure our loan. And 3 of your old customers reached out after seeing the news about Harry's sentencing. They want to bring their business back." Eric nodded, feeling the weight of possibility in those words. The shop was still theirs, though changed. Like them, it carried scars but remained standing. "I've been thinking about what Sarah said about turning pain into purpose," he said, moving to his workbench and pulling out a worn leather notebook. "I've been working on something." Laura joined him at the bench as he opened the notebook, revealing pages of sketches and notes. "A mentorship program," he explained. "For young mechanics starting their own businesses. Teaching them not just about cars, but about protecting themselves from people like Harry." Tears welled in Laura's eyes as she studied the pages. "You're going to be an amazing mentor," she whispered. The next morning, they hosted their first support group meeting in the shop's break room. Jennifer had driven up for it, bringing with her 2 new survivors they'd connected with through their network. The space that had once echoed with Harry's empty promises now rang with genuine laughter, shared tears, and the steady drumbeat of healing. "Sometimes I still catch myself looking over my shoulder," one of the new members, David, admitted. "Wondering if I'll ever trust my own judgment again." "The trust comes back," Jennifer assured him, "but it's different. Wiser. Like a broken bone that heals stronger at the point of fracture." Eric listened, recognizing his own journey in their words. The shame that had once threatened to consume him had transformed into something else, not quite wisdom, not quite strength, but a deep understanding of human vulnerability and resilience. Later that afternoon, as the last of the group members left, Laura brought out the old coffee maker, the one they'd stopped using after Harry's betrayal because the smell brought back too many memories. "I think it's time," she said simply, plugging it in. The familiar aroma filled the shop, but this time it carried new associations, the warmth of genuine connection, the comfort of shared understanding, the promise of renewal. Eric watched as she poured 2 cups, adding cream to his just the way he liked it. They'd developed new rituals over the past months, but some old ones were worth reclaiming, worth redefining. "You know what the hardest part is," he said, accepting the cup. "Learning to trust joy again. To believe in good things without waiting for the other shoe to drop." Laura nodded, understanding flowing between them like an electric current. Maybe that's the real victory, not just surviving the betrayal, but choosing to remain open to life, to love, to possibility. As they sat together in the gathering dusk, the shop around them held echoes of all that had been lost and all that had been gained. Through the window, they could see the first stars appearing in the twilight sky, each one a reminder that even in darkness, light finds its way through. The notebook on Eric's workbench lay open to a fresh page, ready for tomorrow's plans. On the wall above it hung a small frame containing a quote Sarah had sent them: "Healing isn't about becoming who you were before the storm. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be." In the quiet of the evening, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the presence of the woman who had stood beside him through it all, Eric felt something he hadn't expected to feel again: peace. Not the naive peace of before, but something deeper, tempered by experience and strengthened by scars. 1 year later, the autumn light painted shadows across the newly renovated shop floor. Eric stood in the doorway, watching his first mentor, Miguel, walk a customer through a complex transmission repair. The young mechanic's confidence had grown steadily over the past 6 months, his technical skills matched by an increasing awareness of the business aspects Eric had once learned through such bitter experience. The shop's transformation hadn't happened overnight. Like healing itself, it had come in waves, some gentle, others overwhelming. The physical changes were the easiest: fresh paint, updated equipment, a welcoming waiting area where their support group still met twice a month. The deeper changes were harder to quantify but impossible to miss. Laura appeared beside him, coffee cups in hand, their morning ritual reclaimed and redefined. "Jennifer called," she said softly. "They found another one of Harry's victims in Michigan. She's struggling, but she's ready to talk." Eric nodded, feeling the familiar mix of sadness and purpose. Their network had grown beyond anything they'd imagined, becoming a lifeline for others caught in the aftermath of betrayal. Each new story still hurt, but now the pain came with a sense of direction, of meaning. "I'll call her this evening," he replied, accepting the coffee. After Miguel's certification test. The pride in Laura's eyes matched his own. Miguel wasn't just learning to be a mechanic, he was learning to trust his instincts, to recognize red flags, to build a business on a foundation of genuine relationships rather than empty promises. Later that afternoon, as Miguel emerged from the testing center clutching his advanced certification, his face split into a wide grin. "I passed," he exclaimed, then immediately sobered. "I couldn't have done this without you both." "You did the work," Laura assured him, but Eric caught the deeper meaning in Miguel's words. It wasn't just about the certification. It was about learning to believe in himself again after his own encounter with a con artist had nearly destroyed his family's business 2 years ago. That evening, their kitchen table hosted a different kind of gathering. Sarah Morgan had flown in for the first time, her presence both grounding and surreal. The woman whose warnings had helped them catch Harry now sat across from them, sharing stories of her own ongoing journey of recovery. "Sometimes I still wake up angry," Sarah admitted, cradling her tea. "Not at him anymore, but at myself for not seeing it sooner. Then I remember what my therapist said, that our capacity to trust isn't a weakness. It's what makes us human." Laura reached across the table, taking Sarah's hand. "It's what makes us survivors, not victims." The conversation flowed into the night, touching on their various healing journeys. Jennifer had recently started her own support group in her hometown. The Richardsons had rebuilt their construction company with new safeguards in place. Each story was different, yet connected by threads of resilience and hope. As their guests began to leave, Eric found himself in the garage, staring at the old workbench where he'd first dreamed of expansion. The dreams hadn't died with Harry's betrayal, they'd evolved, become more grounded, more authentic. Laura joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "Penny, for your thoughts." "I was thinking about something Miguel said today," Eric replied, turning to face her. "About how learning to trust again is like learning to walk after an injury. You have to rebuild the muscles, but you also have to believe you can do it." She smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening with understanding. "And how are your trust muscles feeling these days?" Eric considered the question carefully. "Stronger," he said finally. "Different. Like they've been rewired to carry more weight, but also to recognize when something's off balance." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, Miguel returning with some paperwork he'd forgotten. As Eric watched Laura welcome him back with the same warmth she showed their own son, he felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. This was their real expansion, not in square footage or profit margins, but in the depth and authenticity of their connections. The shop had become more than a business, it was a sanctuary where broken trust could be rebuilt, where survival stories could be shared, where healing could take root and grow. Later that night, as Eric lay awake listening to Laura's steady breathing beside him, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely, perhaps it never would. But it had transformed into something else, a deep well of empathy, a source of wisdom, a foundation for helping others find their way through similar storms. Their story wasn't just about surviving betrayal anymore. It was about choosing to remain open to life's possibilities while carrying the lessons of the past. It was about finding strength not in isolation, but in connection. Most of all, it was about discovering that the greatest act of defiance against those who would break our trust is to learn to trust again, wisely, carefully, but completely. As sleep finally began to claim him, Eric's last thought was of the sign they'd hung in the shop's new waiting area, words that had become their unofficial motto: healing happens in community. In the end, that was Harry's unintended legacy, teaching them that while trust could be broken by one person, it could be rebuilt by many, creating something stronger and more beautiful than before.